in these systems of abuse, no one wins. Very few people win.
Yeah.
And even those people, you can actually argue, like, the Jeff Bezos who's literally so scared of the world that he's helped create, literally trying to fuck off to another planet. Is he really winning? Like, does he sleep at night in the same way that the rest of us do? Probably not.
So one of the things, listeners, that happens quite often here is that I will meet someone very cool, and then I will send Ben I'm going to say it's a WhatsApp voice note, but I think he might call it a mini podcast.
Yeah, a little episode.
A little episode about how excited I am about this person and why they're so cool and how I can't wait for us to meet them on the podcast. And actually this happened with our next guest. So I'm going to tell them a mini story. I was really tired one day. But I was meeting up.
I love that that's the beginning of the story. I was really tired one day.
Yeah, it might be the beginning of all my stories. I was really tired one day, and I was meeting up with one of our former guests here, Clover Hogan, to catch up. And we all know that Clover is a superstar.
Shout out Clover.
And also young, which I am not in terms of the energy spectrum. And she was like, come with me to this event, it's gonna be really cool. Like, and I was like, I just really don't want to move from the seat that I'm on. But I did. I went with her to this event, and and she was like, you're gonna love all these speakers, you got to meet her. She's just one of the most articulate sound voices on climate. And now that's like quite a lot coming from Clover. So I went along, because I did not let the worst parts of my nature take over and take me to bed. And I went along, and Clover was right. And I'm so excited to have this person joining us on the podcast today. I'm gonna, Ben, let you do a bit of an intro, because I've already gushed on about her for I think a bit too long.
We are joined today by 22-year-old climate activist Days Ayaji.
Perfect. You pronounce it so well. I'm so
in the
proud
streets,
of you.
man. I'm outside. Do you know what I mean? We've been doing this. And Days, you are a member of Extinction Rebellion? Am I correct in saying that? Okay.
A fond member, a love and hate relationship, as you imagine.
Yes. as is the way. And you also stood for election for becoming a member of European Parliament.
Yes, I did, being the youngest to do so.
Oh my gosh.
Oh,
okay.
yes.
Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Will you tell us a bit about, because I'm curious about what you're focused on now in your activism. Give us some good headlines.
So the idea is, in essence, like, a lot of my work spans a lot of different fields, because I'm trying to see what works.
Right.
I acknowledge that there has to be many different types of activism. And even though, like, as I said, I'm part of Extinction Rebellion, the awakening for me was quite traditional. It was on the streets, it was organising protests. That's what people see as activism, right? But then people don't see the consultancy that I do with big business as activism. People don't see the philanthropy work as activism. People don't see suing the government or running for election as a part of activism.
Right.
I love this, actually. I do think sometimes when you're an individual who does lots of different things, which are underpinned with a similar value set or mission or purpose, for someone from the outside, it can feel really like, oh, what are all these different dispersed things you're doing? And I think it can be really discouraging for people. And I just, that's why I wanted to highlight it, because I actually think that when you are clear on your mission and what you're doing,
Exactly.
it does manifest in lots of different ways, and that may not make sense to someone who doesn't understand what's underlying it. So I just
also, it's
shout
a
out to that
personality type kind of thing. Like, okay, I'm gonna go woo-woo here, because like I do have a background in well-being, but like, have you guys heard of?
How do you have so many backgrounds?
I mean,
when I say like I do not sleep. No, like I come from like a workaholic mom, so that's something I've had to learn how to like get out of.
Yeah.
But yeah, I try to kind of keep. Because I don't know, I feel like my mum, when we were growing up, she always told us, like, our jobs in the world is to make the world a better place for the next generation.
Oh, wow.
So therefore, everything I do has always been very purpose-driven.
Right.
And I've been quite lucky to kind of force the opportunity to happen. Like, my first job was in Amnesty International. I sent them an email. I was like, I want to work here.
Give me a job.
Give me a job. They did give me a job, actually. And stuff like this. Exactly. So it's like, how can you create your own space, especially as a Black woman? You have to create your own space because no one's here to give it to you.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like the harsh realities. So I grew up in London. My voice is a decoy. I grew up in Tottenham. I grew up in Ends. I grew up in poverty. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment apartment, 5 of us. And that's, people forget that that's reality for a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's not an unusual story. But then my mum, she's an amazing Nigerian woman. So let's just say if there's a will, there's a way. And she made it a way. My mum basically was like, I'm going to send you to get the education I didn't have. So she sent us to boarding school. But she sent us to a very particular type of boarding school.
Right.
Because she wanted us to get really good education, but she didn't want us to be dicks.
Yeah.
That was like her main thing.
It's a very important decision to make as a parent.
Exactly. She was like, I want you to, but you can't be dicks. So she sent us to this boarding school that's like one of the only boarding schools that was attached to a normal state grammar.
Right.
But then also it was in a deprived area. And that, you see, very weird combinations. I learned how to love nature. My house parent taught me how to make ponds, how to grow food. And it was like all of these moments is like me building a relationship with nature. So when I came back to London, at this point my family was living in Edmonton, not that far from Tottenham. I basically started getting very ill. And when I got ill, I realized that, my doctor was lying to me. And he was like, oh, it's just growing up, it will figure itself out. But then I found out.
It was puberty. Wild.
Tell me about it.
Yeah.
I was like, I can't breathe. Like, this has got nothing to do with puberty. But it ended up being air pollution, which was the issue. And the fact that there was an incinerator literally located around a mile away from my house. Yes, and this incinerator in the vicinity, there was hospitals, there was schools, and this, even the Edmonton incinerator is still a big issue today. And then I realized, okay, it's not just these people being bad about air quality and how it's affecting ethnic minorities and working class communities. It's a global thing, and that's when I went into deep depression and anxiety for years. I went into I'm going to do everything as an individual. I'm going to go zero waste. I'm going to go vegan.
I'm going to change it in my own house.
In my own house. Me literally stuffing 10 weeks of rubbish in a plastic jar. You get what I mean? Shit like that. But then accidentally, so now we're getting to the question. So I was in university. I had meningitis. My best friend knew about my climate angst and how I didn't trust any organization. I was like Greenpeace, all of them, Friends of the Earth, And my friend told me about Extinction Rebellion, and I was like, oh, a bunch of Caucasians gluing themselves to the floor. No, thank you. Literally, when I tell you, I was like, even my mom, she was like, they're mad people, But I still was like, I'm open to go. I've got nothing but time right now.
Right.
When I say I went there and it changed my life forever, it was just insane. I remember going to that meeting, and for the first time, someone asked me, how was I in a very long time, and actually wanted to hear it.
Yeah.
And I, the first time, I was like, I'm fine. Why are you asking?
Leave me alone.
I was so defensive. Exactly.
I just came for the meeting.
Exactly. I just came for the meeting. And then the second time, I actually fell apart, and I was like, I have recognized the life that I want to live is just not going to happen. And I don't know where next to go, and it was this gushing of emotion, but then also feeling very held as well by the people who didn't know me, who didn't actually owe me any kindness, but were just kind and soft and loving, and that was a Wednesday. By the Monday, they were like, do you want to become a coordinator? We're planning to shut down all the roads in central London in April. I was like, these people are crazy, but I'm here for it.
It's glue me down.
I'm here for it. And that was the beginning of everything.
Wow.
This really quite fast-paced education, this upskilling in a way that was so authentic of you learn, you try again, you fail, you try again, trying lots of different things, but then also feeling really emotionally held through becoming a young person in a time of crisis.
Gosh. A real superhero origin story.
It's absolutely. And also I think for me, the thing that really stands out is the importance of community, right?
Massively.
And finding that,
100%.
If you want to do this, if you want to make a difference in the world, if you want to do something, right, you've got to find the people who will ask you how you are, who will hold you, but will also be like, come do this crazy thing with us. And you're like, yes. But also I think just in terms of the climate movement, because part of, the reason we set up this podcast is that Ben and I never felt like part of the climate movement. We wanted to find different ways in. I actually think it can be intimidating because maybe everyone feels like, oh, you've had to be doing this for a very long time to be able to be involved. But that's, really not true.
Exactly. And I always say lots of people in the climate movement, they come from generations of climate activists. I did not. My mom, climate wetting. Well, what is that? That's what she said. And I came from a place that wasn't based in the actual political action, but was based in a place of care.
Yeah.
And I think that's especially when you start looking into ethnic minority communities, it's like there is so much care and like community feeling, and community in like the ways that we've lived before, that like it's like it doesn't matter about the actual topic, it's about how do you create it and how do we take that into spaces that need it, and I think community is like the only way we're going to get out of this shit, like really is.
Okay, so I'm just so pleased that you shared that story with us, because I think, like you said, it's really important to know, I think, for people how everyone's route into this is so personal, so different.
Yeah.
But the thing that I want us to get into is this idea of the individual versus the system. I guess I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah.
And then I'd love to explore a little bit around how does the individual fit into this conversation.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the first bit is, this is ironically at my TEDx talk. I talked about basically the fact that like everyone's so focused on it being about the climate. It really is not about the climate. The climate is merely a byproduct of fucked up shit that keeps fucking up,
right.
And that's what people don't get. When I say like climate, people think it's about carbon. It's not about that. It's about how we've learned how to use and abuse each other through history and how it's playing itself out today. Whether this is racial issues, whether this is homophobia, like a whole bunch of stuff. It's like we've learned how to basically treat each other like shit. We took the same energy to the earth and she went, yeah, nah.
No, I'll kill you. Yeah. You're done.
Exactly. She basically went, no, I've got this boundary and I'm showing you. Yeah. And the climate change is merely her saying, enough's enough, get your shit together. And that's what we have to see it as. We have to see it as a warning in order to change like the societal ills that have created it. Like I always go back, like in the UK, especially as like someone who have a historical background, like I go back to the enclosures. Do you know what the enclosures is? Okay. So back in the day, in the UK, lots of parts of the UK was just common ownership. Everyone grazed on it. People planted their own food for their communities. They traded in a very like rudimentary way of like, if you have sheep and I have carrots, we'll just trade each other when I need some fur and you need some carrots, and that's how it worked. But then when the beginnings of capitalism came in, what happened was lots of the elite basically said, okay, now I own this land and I'm taking it. I'm fencing this shit and I'm leaving you out dry. So people are like, oh my God, I literally live off the land. So what do? I have to go into the workforce in order to have access to the land. With this, you start to see the beginning of like wage labor, of where they were like, okay, now we have so many people who need work to have access to the land, we can pay them shit because they need us anyway, and then that's when you start to see the beginnings of capitalism in the way that we know it, moving straight into the Industrial Revolution. And then at this point, someone had an idea that was like, this land ain't enough. I need to go elsewhere. Yeah. I need to move around, and this is the beginnings of colonialism. It's this kind of spread of the ways that we've learned how to use and abuse one another. And this is like what we're seeing now, and even like, I think colonialism is linked back to a lot of the social ills that we're facing, whether it's, like the lack of care for people from working class backgrounds, the lack of care for people who identify out of the traditional norms, the lack of care for Black and brown people, the lack of care for literally the earth. Because when you start to look at colonialism, you start to see the earth, especially like in indigenous wisdom, right? A lot of indigenous groups all across the world, one thing they really have in common is that they see her as her. They see earth and nature as living being in itself with its own consciousness. If you're trying to do capitalism, that doesn't work.
Yeah, you
need to see it as a resource.
You
need to see people as a resource. You need to see the earth as a resource, and that's a link back to the climate crisis.
Yeah.
So this is why I'm like, we can all talk about carbon capture. That's an important part. But if we're only talking about that, we're really missing the point here. Because if we go down that route, the next thing you know, we're going to be breaking other planetary boundaries and finding ourselves in the exact same place of catastrophe. What we have to do is we have to solve these social ills in order to solve the climate crisis. We have to think, how do we act in love, duty, and care? How do we take that our moral responsibility as humans, as people, as citizens, as living life on this earth. How do we take that to shape the world, the physical and like, you know, like cultural world that we live in, you know, and like without doing that work, like you might as well just pack it up, you know, go home, fly to Ibiza and pretend that nothing's happening.
Yeah.
Because, you know, we can't do this, you know, with just net zero strategies. It has to be holistic.
I have so many questions.
And what an accessible way into the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, I feel like that really caught my, it's weird to say, it really caught my heart, but it did, like, in a way that, like, it doesn't always do. Because I think you're talking about really tangible problems and issues. And I think one of the big things I've learned on this journey is that so much of this conversation is framed around, we have to protect the animals, we have to protect the planet, we have to make more food, or we have to find different ways of doing this, or get rid of the gases, or blah. And I think this is actually about like a framing that is really personal. About like what's wrong with our society, which I guess there's a big question for me, and I'm sure, Mariam, you've got several smaller questions which might do a better job. But like, how do we, because I think one of the things that you can feel as an individual is like a very quick sense of overwhelm. So like, the conversation can move from, rather than solving the climate crisis, now you also need to solve racism and sexism and homophobia, which is all true, right? We do actually, like, even if we solve the climate crisis, we'll just find ourselves in another one if we don't resolve those issues.
Exactly.
But how does the individual move to a space where they can start to challenge or tackle those big issues? I think somebody called them wicked problems on another episode that we've done, right? But like, how do we start to get into those things, or rather than how did you start to get into those issues?
So in the beginning of my activism, I kind of had to find, what is my role here?
Right.
You know, and I think that's like the hardest. It's placing yourself in the movement and then figuring out where you're creating space for yourself. And this is where the well-being element came in. So I started learning about this thing called regenerative cultures. It's the idea of how do we build healthy and resilient cultures that hold us through hard times, but then push us into the world that we want to live in. And that's like very like, is one of those things that like, you know, it's what it means nothing and everything all at the same time kind of thing.
That actually have meaning but don't feel like they do.
Exactly. So so typically every regenerative culture is different because it's adapting to the people who live within it and who it will serve. But the one that I kind of learnt about is it's broken up in like 5 elements. This is typically for activists. So the first one is what the individual, but we call it like a self-care.
Right.
So the whole idea is not about face masks. It's not about relaxing on one day of the week as you like run yourself raw the rest. It's about how, one, do we take care of our mind, our bodies, our souls, but then also how do we do what's called like the inner work? And the inner work is, how do we ask ourselves, what part in society do we play into the society that we don't like?
Right.
And it's a very uncomfortable work. But it's necessary work. The next part to that is interpersonal care. So it's been between me to you. You know, it's like, how do I kind of take the same understanding of softness that I've learned how to give myself to others? How can I learn how to hold you emotionally through what we're facing? How do I learn how to tell you the truth, even when the truth is really hard? You know, and how do I take this into the third part, community? How do I take this into the larger? How can we hold each other as a community? How can we see when someone's suffering and say, oh, okay, do I have the capacity to be able to help this person? You know? And a lot of the things I'm talking about, it really stems to emotional intelligence. We never talk about emotional intelligence. And it's actively shunned upon in our community, actually. You know, you're called a snowflake or say that it's not that deep, though. That's what my brothers like to say.
It's not that deep.
Exactly. Exactly, you know. And it's like, how do you kind of break away from that and learn how to act in community? The fourth is action care. And I think we use it in activism to talk about the moments of high pressure. And I think it can be used outside of activism too, of like, for example, like the pub is cold, the pub is warm and dry, or do I go, actually I'm going to put myself in discomfort for the greater good for us? How can I take care of you? Do I put an umbrella over you? Do I read you a story? Do I make sure you have food and you are warm? You know, how do I learn to be an active part in my community, even when it's very difficult and it means that we are sacrificing, you know? And then the final bit is planetary care, earth care. How do I take the same energy of love, care, like sacrifice to the earth. The person, like, and especially like I've had this like real feeling and gravitas to like, you know, like I talk about like the masculine, the feminine, because I think like the idea of like gender is like so, you know, but you need all the words, right? And it's like when we start to talk about the feminine, especially like I think Earth is she's a mix of feminine and masculine. And it's like it's the love that she has for us, even when we're actively like destroying her. You know, she is still providing us food, water, air to breathe. She is our lifeline. We literally depend on her.
Yeah, we
but then
couldn't
also
exist without,
at the same time, she's fucking pissed. She is pissed, you know, and this is the tough love, that Mother Earth is giving us. And once we start to recognize, we have to hear her. But the whole idea is basically we just need to learn how to like behave ourselves, you know, and take that everywhere we go.
Before I ask my question, I love that framework because it gives us a way of progressing as well.
Yeah.
So you don't feel like you have to do all 5 at once. And that's the question I
no.
had, right? You don't start
You don't even need
and
to
on
do them
day
in order,
one.
you know.
Yeah, but you don't like day one, I'm gonna do all 5. Like
Yeah.
day one, you start somewhere.
Yeah.
Ask
and then,
yourself a question.
yeah. And then you grow, which I think helps because I think that speaks to what you were saying, Ben, around this overwhelm. And if you can actually know where to take a first step and know that if you take that first step, it leads to the others, I think that can be really helpful and is an interesting like way of thinking about this.
Yeah.
Because I think that the thing that comes to mind when I listen to you is this idea that this is not and I've heard people say this so many times, and it's a bit of a cliche, but actually listening to you makes it feel much more real, is the idea that it's a marathon. Like, we have to be in it for the long term, and if you're going to be in it for the long term, you can't behave the same way. Like, I keep thinking the word that comes to mind for me listening to you is this idea of extractive. We have our mindsets are extractive, right?
Yeah.
Our economic systems are extractive. All of it's extractive. The idea is that you're taking everything that someone or something has, leaving it with nothing.
Yeah, even when we talk about ourselves.
Right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
But
and
if
we need
you
to purge ourselves,
if your activism
you know?
is extractive,
then
it's like is it bell hooks?
Yeah.
The master's tools.
Yeah.
Where it helps you to no, it's not
Angela Davis.
It's Angela Davis.
Yeah.
That's the quote that keeps coming to my mind.
Too,
Obviously, I misquoted it. Sorry, listeners.
Master's tools will never dismantle the master's house.
Yeah.
That's what comes to mind is that this is what that is. That's why it feels uncomfortable in a way, right?
Audre Lorde.
Audre Lorde. Oh my God, we all got it wrong.
Oh my gosh, are we even activists? What's going on here?
I haven't have the book, the little pamphlet, but I'm wondering like whether that's part of it. Is because I keep thinking about how this idea that, let's say we fast forward 100 years into the future.
Yeah.
And we have these, in an optimistic scenario, we have these two options, right?
Yeah.
This is if things go well. We either have this way where it's like, oh, look at all of these systems that we fixed and everyone is living in this better way. Or we could be like, oh yeah, 100 years ago, they had the option to fix everything, but instead they just fixed the carbon and everything else is still shit.
Yeah.
And I can imagine people in 100 years would be like, well, why on earth did you do that?
Yeah.
Like, why did you choose when you had to do things and they were both hard? Why did you choose the one that wouldn't fix everything?
Exactly. Yeah. And then also, like, who is that serving? Like,
well, exactly.
No one. Because like in these systems of abuse, no one wins. Very few people win. And even those people, you can actually argue, like, the Jeff Bezos who's literally so scared of the world that he's helped create, literally trying to fuck off to another planet. Is he really winning? Like, does he sleep at night in the same way that the rest of us do? Probably not. Because at the end of the day, like, even though we like to create the baddie, he is human.
Yeah.
At the end of the day.
He's a part of the same system.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Under the same pressures.
Yeah. Only one person wins Monopoly and then it's not fun to play anymore.
Yeah.
We just play it by yourself.
And that
I think this lands us in quite a nice place to maybe wrap up. If we think about the world in 2050, we think about the future from here, and everything has gone to plan. We've achieved the goals. We've solved the problem. What does that world look like? And I know you spoke about like a world that you would like to live in. What does that world look like for you?
Yeah. Oh my God, I've done this so many times because I'm a visioner. I need to remember what I'm fighting for. So I think, okay, I'm actually going to kind of go a bit sideways and go for like the journey.
Okay.
You know, because I think when we talk about the climate crisis, and especially when we vision, we kind of forget this middle ground, that uncomfortable. People are going to suffer. People are already suffering, and we need to know that. You know, so when we see the suffering, we don't go, oh, it's already happened. Game over, guys. Pack our bags, let's go home, you know? And it's like we have to recognize that there is going to be really fucking hard times ahead. And what we need is the resilience, you know? And this kind of comes back to the inner work of where we learn how to treat each other and treat ourselves well. So we have the resilience to get through the hard times.
Right.
But the world that I envision, like, so I always say, like, it's about, like, you know, for example, like me and one of my closest friends, he's called Rabbi Jeffrey, and he's like a 74-year-old amazing Jewish rabbi who, like, gets arrested, like, every old weekend. You know what I mean?
That's a real rabbi, man.
Exactly, real rabbi. Us two listening to grime music, kind of going around, oh yeah, as we're going around and we're seeing people, you know, being socially prescribed baking classes to get through their depression and anxiety, whether it's people being in nature and learning in nature, learning how to play. I want to see like 40-year-olds in suits who go into the offices to go and create, you know, net zero strategies, but then also in the same breath, they're outside playing with mushrooms. You know, I want to see a world of where we are so connected to nature. We recognize that nature is us and we are nature. And that's the only way we can see the world. So therefore, everything will change, whether it's our architecture, the way that we organize communities, you know, the way that we connect to one another, everything will change, you know, and the tangibility of that. And I think this is kind of where like the imagination element of this comes in. It's like, in order to get there, we need to break through a lot of social conditioning that's allowed us to kind of get here. You know, the social conditioning that tells you, oh, are you good enough? Do you even know what you're saying? Is your voice actually worth being heard? You know, and we need to get through that. We need to purge ourselves of that in order to actually be able to see the world in the ways of what could be, you know, and that's like the big thing, I think. And I think that's a journey and, you know, what we should take. So everyone's future could look very different and it could look very tailored, you know, and that's the love of regenerative cultures of Anas. It's different for everyone. And that's amazing.
I want to go on this walk with you and the rabbi in the future.
Yes, exactly. Listening to like Jamie or something.
But I also love that idea that there's like in the version of the future that you imagine, there's like a multiplicity of possibilities. Do you know what I mean? It's not just everybody has to subscribe to this one thing and every single person will be playing with mushrooms. But like it's like there are multiple ways of connecting with the earth and being a part of that rather than us seeing it as a resource.
100%.
And we all get to figure out our own ways of doing that. That's a beautiful picture of the future.
Thank you for taking us there.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I'm sure you never thought that's where I was going.
No, I love it. I love it.
That's like in my head when I think of what am I doing in 2050? Like that's what I'm doing.
We have one last question for you.
And now it's time for our climate confessions. Let's fess up to the bad habits we just can't kick.
So we want to basically ask all of our guests for a climate confession, something that you do or consume, something, and it can be as easy as something you eat, and it can be as difficult as a way as you are in the world. That is your climate confession that you know you could be doing better. What would you like to confess?
Oh my God. Okay. Oh my God, my grandma's watching me. I can feel it. You know what I mean? My grandma's Catholic, so yes. Okay. Like, cause I think now I've generated two.
Okay.
So the first one is like, do you know like that phrase like Uber everywhere?
Yeah.
I take it literally. Because like, especially when you don't have time. And this is what I've realized over the last and this kind of relates to my second one about how since I think 2015, I haven't flown till this year, you know? Oh yeah, exactly. And it's this I've got to this point of where I'm extremely time poor. And on Earth Day, I literally had 5 events I had to make before leaving. And I was trying to figure out this train thing. I was like, can I? Like literally, I was like, I can't, you know, and this is the only way I'm going to get to where I need to go and rest, but then also spend time with my friends who I have not been seeing so often, you know, because of the work. And it was this kind of guilt. But then also I was like, why am I being like this? Because if it was someone else, I would have had so much softness for them and grace for them.
Yes.
But for me, I couldn't have that, or I felt like I couldn't, so it's been like a real kind of like moment. And since then, like I've taken 2 flights this year. And for me, who hasn't flown in years, it's been interesting. But then also it's like trying to get through that, like the person in your head that's like, everyone's dying because you're going to Lisbon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's like a voice in my head.
Yeah. You know what? I'll tell you something. Whenever that voice in my head comes in, another voice comes in and says, no, everyone's dying because the CEO of Shell, ExxonMobil, doesn't give a shit.
Yeah.
And you can put that on the
And
podcast.
that's the end of the podcast.
Bye.
No. Do you know, thank you so much for first of all, for spending time with us.
It's been a
And secondly,
pleasure.
I feel so encouraged at the end of this conversation. And it doesn't always happen, but I think you, for me, encapsulate like the fullness of what this is all about. Like the image of like a real like robust understanding of what the issues are, with also a real lived experience of like why this is important, but also like a real focus on like well-being and wellness and mental health and like self-care and like what you just said at the end, like that idea of a softness that like you have for other people, but also you recognize you need to have for yourself. And I think like we spoke about a world that you imagine in the future, but that's like a world that I feel like I can live in now. Do you know what I mean? Like one where we're not burying our heads in the sand and we're not avoiding the issues, but also there is actually a pathway through it to something that is better.
Yeah.
So I feel so like, thank you so much
I think
for
it's
being here
actually
and
been
for
so.
sharing.
This is like my favorite podcast I've ever recorded. This has been a whole vibe.
Yes. Thank you. I'm going to echo everything Ben said. And I'm also going to say that I think there's, not only is there a way forward, but also that you can do it in a way that isn't like punishing to yourself. Like, we don't have to punish ourselves to move forward, because then also what kind of world do we end up with if everyone in 30, 40 years is mentally destroying themselves to get there? So I just wonderful. Loved it. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for listening.
So much. Thank you so much for joining us this week. We really hope you enjoyed this episode.
If you did, please rate, subscribe, and share this episode with a curious friend. It makes it possible to keep making this amazing content for you.
Oh, and slide into our DMs at TEDx London and let us know which climate extraordinaires you'd love to hear from next time. But wait, that is not all.
No, this podcast was produced by the amazing Josie Coulter.
Curation and research by the genius Tara Cooper.
Artwork designed by the visionaries that are Sabrina Russo and Rebecca Mingus.
Mixed and engineered by the iconic Ben Beheshti, aka The Falcon, who also composed our banging theme tune.
Presented by me, Mariam Pasha.
And by me, Ben Hurst. Stay curious.